The heavy steel door of the old abandoned shipyard swung open with a bone-chilling creak that sounded like a scream. Inside the dark, cold warehouse, Maya was forced onto her knees on the greasy concrete floor. Her mouth was sealed shut with thick silver tape, and her natural curls were messy from the struggle. Standing over her was Alex, a cruel gang leader who looked down at her like she was just a piece of trash. He slowly pulled a long, jagged knife from its leather case, letting the moonlight catch the sharp edge before he pressed the cold metal right against Maya's throat. He wasn't just trying to kidnap her. He wanted to use her to destroy the man he hated most, her husband. "Smile for the camera, sweetheart," Alex hissed with a nasty grin, thrusting his glowing smartphone just inches from her face. He started a live video and sent it directly to a private number. "Hey, Mr. Florist. I've got your little Rose right here. You have exactly 5 minutes to get down here and beg me for her life. If you're even 1 second late, I'm going to start cutting her one piece at a time." To show he wasn't joking, he kicked a heavy metal chair right next to her head, creating a loud bang that echoed through the room. Maya flinched, but as she looked into the camera lens, she didn't look defeated. Instead, she looked at the screen with a strange kind of pity, as if she knew that Alex had just signed his own death warrant by calling the man on the other end. June didn't jump or scream when his phone began to play the video of his wife in danger. Instead, he became terrifyingly still. His warm, kind eyes suddenly turned cold and empty, like a predator spotting its prey. He set his phone down with a slow, heavy click that sounded like a judge's hammer. He walked to his hallway closet and touched a hidden spot on the wall. A secret door slid open, revealing rows of black suits and high-tech weapons. The nice, quiet husband had vanished. The sleeping lion, the most feared mafia boss in history, was finally awake, and he was ready to hunt. The morning sun was warm at the local market. The air smelled like fresh bread and sweet fruit. June walked through the crowd slowly. He wore an old, baggy hoodie and thick glasses. He looked like any other ordinary man. To the people there, he was just the quiet one. He was the nice, shy guy who always bought the best vegetables for his wife. He liked being a nobody. It was his way of keeping Maya safe. June stopped at a vegetable stall. He picked up 2 large red tomatoes. He smiled at the shopkeeper and asked for a lower price. He didn't use a loud voice or act tough. He just acted like a simple husband trying to save a few cents. For 5 years, June had hidden his true self in these quiet streets. He had buried his dark past deep underground. He thought he was finally free. Suddenly, his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a sharp, aggressive sound that broke the peaceful morning. June pulled it out. His face was calm until the screen lit up. Then his world stopped. On the screen was a video of Maya. She was tied up in a dark, dirty place. Her mouth was taped shut. Her eyes were wide and filled with tears. Then a man's voice came through the speaker. It was Alex. He laughed and called June a weak coward. He told June he had 5 minutes to save her or she would never come home. June didn't scream. He didn't cry. But something inside him snapped. The kindness in his eyes vanished. They became cold and dark, like a predator watching its prey. His hand began to squeeze the tomato he was holding. He squeezed harder and harder until the fruit exploded. The red juice sprayed across his hand and dripped onto the floor like fresh blood. It was a silent promise of what was coming. The quiet one was gone. The mafia boss had returned. June did not call the police. He knew the law was far too slow for a man like Alex. His wife did not have time for sirens and paperwork. He used a clean white handkerchief to wipe the red tomato juice from his hand. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. He walked away from the market with a heavy, steady pace. Every step he took felt like the ground was shaking beneath him. The shy, clumsy husband was gone. In his place was a man who moved like a shadow in the night. He was no longer a victim. He was the hunter. He walked into a quiet, narrow street. He stopped in front of a small, dusty shop. The sign above the door said "Vintage Watch Repair" in fading gold letters. It was a peaceful place that looked like it belonged in a different century. When June stepped inside, a tiny bell chimed softly. The air inside was thick and smelled like old oil and cold metal. An elderly man with gray hair sat behind a wooden counter. He was busy fixing a tiny gear with a magnifying glass. He did not look up. He thought it was just another local customer looking for a quick fix. June walked right up to the counter. He did not say hello. He did not ask for a repair. He leaned forward until his face was close to the glass. He spoke 3 words in Korean. His voice was like shifting gravel. It was low, cold, and full of absolute command. It was a voice that hadn't been used in 5 long years. It was the voice of a man who owned the city. The elderly man froze instantly. His hands began to shake and he dropped his tiny metal tools. They clattered loudly on the desk. He slowly looked up and saw June's eyes. He did not see a quiet neighbor or a nice florist. He saw a ghost he thought had been buried forever. Without saying a word, the old man came out from behind the desk. He bowed so low that his forehead touched the cold, dark wood of the counter. It was the deep bow of a servant finally meeting his king again. The old man reached under the desk and pressed a hidden silver button. Slowly, the wall behind the counter began to groan and move. It rotated in a smooth circle, revealing a secret room hidden in the shadows. Inside, a single bright spotlight hid a glass case. It held a perfectly tailored black suit, sharp enough to cut skin. Next to it lay a heavy, gold-plated Desert Eagle pistol. It glowed under the lights, looking beautiful and deadly. June stepped into the secret room. He pulled off his old, faded hoodie and threw it on the floor like it was trash. He put on the black jacket and felt the familiar heavy weight of the weapon in his hand. He checked the magazine with a sharp metallic click. The nobody who sold flowers was officially dead. The true boss of the city was back. He looked at his reflection in the glass and did not smile. He had a kingdom to reclaim and a wife to bring home. He was going to make Alex regret the day he was born. Inside the dark, drafty warehouse, Alex was feeling like a god. He poured himself a glass of expensive amber whiskey and tossed it back with a loud, mocking laugh. He paced back and forth in front of Maya, his heavy boots clicking against the concrete like a countdown. His men stood around them in the shadows, leaning against crates and playing with their pocket knives. They were all grinning, convinced that they had already won the night. Alex stopped and leaned down, blowing a puff of bitter cigar smoke directly into Maya's face. "Do you hear that, sweetheart?" Alex asked, cupping his ear and smirking. "That is the sound of absolute silence. Your husband isn't coming. A guy like that doesn't have the guts for a fight. Right now he is probably shaking under his bed or crying in a dark corner of his little flower shop. He is a nobody. A coward. He's just a weak little man who let his most valuable prize get snatched away without a fight." Maya's natural curls were matted with sweat, and her wrists were raw from the thick ropes, but her spirit was far from broken. She didn't look at the knife in Alex's hand. Instead, she turned her head slowly to look at the rusted clock hanging on the far wall. The red second hand was ticking steadily. She knew June better than anyone in the world. She knew that when he became truly angry, he didn't scream, he became a ghost. She knew that the quiet one was just a mask for a man who moved with the precision of a surgeon and the heart of a lion. Maya took a deep, shaky breath. Through the thick silver tape over her mouth, she forced out a single muffled word. It was barely a whisper, but it carried a weight that made the air in the room feel heavy. "Run," she groaned through the gag. Alex froze for a second, then doubled over in laughter. He slapped his knee, pointing his finger at her while his goons joined in the mocking chorus. "Run? You think I should run from a florist?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the high tin ceiling. He was so busy enjoying his own joke that he didn't notice the strange stillness settling over the building. He didn't notice that his walkie-talkie, which usually buzzed with the chatter of his perimeter guards, had gone completely silent. He didn't know that 3 of his best men outside had already been dragged into the darkness without making a single sound. Alex reached for his radio to call for a status report, his thumb hovering over the button with arrogant confidence. He was completely unaware that the hunter was already inside the fence. The nobody was no longer miles away. He was right outside the door, and the time for running had already passed. The warehouse had always been a place of noise. The whistling wind, the dripping water, and the loud, ugly laughter of Alex's men. But suddenly the air changed. It became heavy and still as if the building itself was holding its breath. High above in the rusted rafters, a single light bulb began to flicker. It buzzed like a dying insect before it popped and went dark. Then another followed. One by one the yellow lights died out, plunging the warehouse into a deep, suffocating blackness. Alex's laughter stopped instantly. He stood frozen in the center of the room, his whiskey glass trembling in his hand. "Fix the lights," he barked, his voice cracking with a fear he couldn't hide. "Someone get to the fuse box now." One of the guards, a large man with a scar across his face, grumbled and pulled out a flashlight. He stepped away from the group and moved toward the heavy steel doors. The beam of his light cut through the dust, but as he reached the edge of the shadows, something moved. There was no gunshot. There was no shout. There was only a soft, wet thud. The guard's flashlight hit the floor, rolling across the concrete and shining aimlessly into a corner. The man was gone, pulled into the darkness so quickly it looked like the shadows had swallowed him whole. In the total silence that followed, a new sound began. It was slow. It was rhythmic. Thud, thud, thud. The heavy, steady sound of combat boots was walking across the concrete. It didn't sound like someone was sneaking. It sounded like someone who owned the world was coming to collect a debt. The footsteps weren't rushing. They were patient. Panic finally broke Alex. He dropped his glass, the sound of shattering crystal echoing like a scream. He lunged forward and grabbed a handful of Maya's hair, yanking her head back and pressing the serrated edge of his knife against her skin. His hands were shaking so violently that the blade nicked her, but he didn't care. He used her as a human shield, spinning around in circles to stare into the blackness. "Show yourself," Alex screamed, his eyes darting toward every corner. "I have her. I'll do it, I swear. Stay back." Maya felt the sting of the blade, but she didn't flinch. She closed her eyes and listened to the footsteps. She knew that rhythm. It was the heartbeat of the lion. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of June's presence. Every second that passed made the warehouse feel smaller, the darkness thicker. Alex's men were backing away, tripping over crates, their breathing coming in shallow, terrified gasps. They realized too late that they weren't the predators anymore. They were the prey, trapped in a cage with a man who had forgotten how to show mercy. The silence was the last warning they would ever get. The silence in the warehouse was so thick it felt like it could shatter. Then a massive groan of metal on metal filled the space. The heavy steel doors, which had been locked tight from the inside, did not just open. They were forced back with a violent, screeching protest. A flood of pale, cold moonlight spilled across the concrete floor, cutting through the thick smoke and dust like a jagged blade. In the center of that light stood a silhouette that made the air in the room turn to ice. June stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He was no longer the man in the faded hoodie. He wore a jet black, bespoke suit that fit him like armor, the fabric shimmering under the moonlight. The glasses were gone, revealing eyes that were sharp, focused, and terrifyingly calm. On the crisp white cuff of his left sleeve, a few drops of fresh blood stood out like rubies, the only sign of the men who had tried to stop him outside. He wasn't sweating. His breathing was slow and perfectly even, as if he had just finished a quiet walk through a garden instead of tearing through a gang of armed killers. He stopped 10 feet away, standing in the center of the light, looking like a king who had come to reclaim a ruined kingdom. Alex stared at him, his mouth hanging open. He looked at the suit, the weapon in June's hand, and the sheer power radiating from the man he had called a nobody. Panic surged through him, making his throat feel tight. He yanked Maya's hair harder, trying to find his courage, but his voice came out as a desperate, high-pitched, shaky mess. "Stay back," Alex screamed, his eyes darting toward the shadows where his men used to be. "I'll kill her. I don't care who you are. Why are you looking at me like that? Say something." June didn't answer right away. He didn't even look at the knife pressed against Maya's throat. Instead he looked at Alex. It wasn't a look of hatred or burning rage. It was something much worse. It was the look a human gives to an ant before stepping on it. A cold, total indifference. To June, Alex was already a ghost. He was a small, insignificant mistake that was about to be erased from the world. You spent so much time watching the nobody, June finally said, his voice a low, melodic growl that vibrated in the chests of everyone left in the room. That you forgot to check under the bed for the monster. You didn't just wake the lion, Alex. You invited him in for a feast. Maya looked up at her husband, and for the first time since the kidnapping she let out a long, shaky breath. She saw the blood on his cuff and the gold of his weapon, but she wasn't afraid. She saw the man she loved, finally dropping the mask to show the world the storm he had been hiding for her sake. The trap was finally set, and Alex was the only one who didn't realize he was already dead. The air in the warehouse felt like it was turning to ice. Alex squeezed his eyes shut for a second, trying to shake off the terror that was paralyzing him. He looked at June's calm face and felt a wave of pure, desperate rage. "What are you all looking at?" Alex screamed at his men, his voice cracking and high-pitched. "He's just one man. Kill him. Shoot him now." His men shifted their weight, their boots scuffing against the concrete, but no one moved. They held their guns with shaking hands, their eyes darting from June to the shadows behind him. They could feel the invisible weight of authority coming from the man in the black suit. It was the kind of power that didn't need to shout to be heard. One of the older henchmen, a man covered in battle scars who had served the underworld for decades, stepped forward. He squinted through the dim moonlight, focusing on June's neck. There, just above the collar of his $10,000 suit, was a small, faded black tattoo. It was the shape of a lion's head, its eyes closed in a silent sleep. The older man's face went pale. His jaw dropped, and the heavy shotgun he was holding slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the floor. "No," the man whispered, his voice trembling with absolute horror. "It can't be. The legend. The sleeping lion. He's real." "What are you doing, you idiot?" Alex roared, stepping toward the man. "Pick up your gun." But the old henchman didn't listen. Instead he dropped to his knees, burying his face in his hands. "Please," he sobbed, his body shaking with fear. "Forgive us, Great One. We didn't know. We were told you were a nobody. Please spare my family." One by one the other guards followed. The sound of metal hitting the floor filled the room as they dropped their weapons. They fell to their knees like a row of dominoes, bowing their heads toward June. The warehouse, which had been Alex's fortress just minutes ago, had become June's throne room. Alex stood alone in the center of the floor, still clutching Maya's hair, but his face was a mask of pure shock. He looked at his men, his loyal killers, begging for mercy from a man they were supposed to kill. He felt his ego shatter into a million pieces. The nobody he had mocked was actually the god of the world he lived in. His hand began to shake so hard he could barely hold the knife. He realized that he wasn't the king of this story. He was just a small, broken boy who had accidentally slapped the face of a giant. June did not stop walking. His polished shoes clicked against the concrete with the steady, haunting rhythm of a ticking clock. Every man in the room held their breath as the sleeping lion moved deeper into the light. He didn't reach for the gold-plated weapon at his hip. He didn't even raise his hands. Instead, he walked directly into the center of the danger, stopping only when the cold, jagged barrel of Alex's gun was pressed firmly against his own forehead. The silence that followed was suffocating. Alex was gasping for air, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. He was still clutching Maya's hair, but his grip was weak, his fingers trembling with a fear that reached deep into his bones. He looked at June's eyes and saw nothing. No fear, no hesitation, only a vast, freezing emptiness. June leaned forward just a fraction of an inch, putting more pressure against the gun barrel. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, melodic whisper that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the warehouse. "You have a choice to make, Alex," June said, his tone as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "It is the only choice you will have left in this life. If you pull that trigger, if you even scratch her skin, you will die in less than a second. My men are in the rafters. They are behind the walls. They are waiting for me to blink. You will be a memory before your shell hits the floor." Alex's hand began to shake so violently that the gun rattled against June's skull. He looked around wildly, realizing for the first time that the shadows were alive. He could feel the red laser dots of unseen snipers dancing across his chest like tiny blood-red insects. He was trapped in a web made of steel and silence. June's eyes narrowed, his gaze locking onto Alex's flickering pupils. But, June continued, his voice dropping even lower, if you let her go right now, if you take your hands off my wife this instant, I might be feeling merciful. I might let you walk out of here alive. And if I do, I will even let you choose which hand you want to lose as payment for touching her. The room seemed to shrink. Alex felt the weight of the gold gun in his hand grow heavy, like it was made of lead. He looked at Maya, then back at the man who was calmly inviting his own death. He realized then that he wasn't negotiating with a human being. He was pleading with a force of nature. The nobody was gone, and the lion was offering a deal that tasted like copper and salt. Alex's finger twitched on the trigger, but his heart had already given up. The power shift was total, and the only thing left was the sound of his own terrified, shallow breathing. The air in the warehouse didn't just feel cold anymore. It felt like it had been sucked out of the room entirely. Alex's face was a mask of sweating, twitching terror. His mind had snapped under the weight of June's calm gaze. With a high-pitched, desperate scream, he tried to pull the trigger. His fingers squeezed down, intent on ending the legend standing before him. But the lion did not wait. In a blur of motion so fast the human eye couldn't even track it, the world tilted. There was a sickening crack of bone and the heavy thud of a body hitting concrete. We didn't see the struggle because there was no struggle, only a predator claiming its prey. When the dust settled, the silence was absolute. June was standing perfectly upright, his $10,000 suit still looking flawless, though his knuckles were now stained with a fresh, dark crimson. Alex was no longer standing. He lay crumpled on the cold floor, clutching his shattered wrist and gasping for air that wouldn't come. He looked up, his eyes glassy with shock, finding himself at the feet of the man he had called a nobody. June didn't look down at him with anger. He looked at him like he was a stain on a polished floor that simply needed to be wiped away. With a flick of a small silver blade that seemed to appear out of thin air, June leaned over Maya. In one smooth motion, the heavy ropes and the silver tape fell away. He didn't say a word as he helped her stand, his touch suddenly changing from deadly to incredibly gentle. Maya leaned into him, her breath finally coming back in deep, relieved gasps. She looked at the man she had married and saw the king he truly was. Suddenly the ground began to vibrate. The low, rhythmic roar of dozens of engines filled the shipyard, growing louder until it vibrated in the very bones of the building. One by one, 20 massive jet-black SUVs tore through the fog and swarmed the warehouse, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Hundreds of men in tactical gear poured out, moving with military precision. They didn't go to Alex's men. They didn't need to. Alex's men were already face down on the floor, trembling in fear. The lead security officer stepped forward and bowed so low his chest nearly touched his knees. "The city is secure, my lord," the officer reported, his voice echoing in the vast space. "The rival gang's assets have been seized. Their influence is gone." Alex watched from the floor, his ego and his life's work turning to ash. He realized then that the flower shop, the quiet life, and the nobody husband had all been a choice June made for love. He had invited a war into a house owned by a god. June wrapped his jacket around Maya's shoulders and began to walk toward the exit, not once looking back at the broken man on the floor. The lion had finished his hunt, and the world now knew exactly who ruled the city. The sirens of the black SUVs hummed in the background, but for Maya the world was silent. She stood in the center of the warehouse, looking at the man she had lived with for 5 years. He was covered in expensive fabric and the blood of his enemies, his eyes still cold and dangerous. Most people would have run away in terror, but Maya didn't flinch. She took a step toward him, her bare feet steady on the cold concrete. She reached up and gently cupped June's face. With the pad of her thumb, she wiped a stray drop of blood from his cheekbone. She didn't look at him with fear. She looked at him with a love that was deeper than any secret. She wasn't just a florist who had been saved. She was the woman who had tamed the lion. June felt the warmth of her touch, and finally the icy mask on his face began to melt. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as he breathed her in. "Let's go home," June whispered. His voice was no longer a roar, but it was still full of power. As they turned to leave, the hundreds of men in tactical gear parted like the Red Sea. They didn't just move, they snapped to attention and bowed their heads in perfect unison. They weren't just bowing to their boss, they were bowing to the woman who held his heart. Maya walked beside June, his heavy jacket draped over her shoulders, her head held high. She wasn't walking behind him, she was walking right at his side. The next morning, the sun rose over their small, familiar street. The flower shop was open just like always. The scent of lilies and roses filled the air, and the colorful petals glowed in the light. But everything had changed. Outside the front door, 4 tall men in sharp black suits stood like stone statues. They didn't say a word, but their presence told the entire city that this shop was off limits. Maya stood behind the counter, trimming the stems of a fresh bouquet. She looked out the window and saw a black car parked across the street, knowing June was watching over her from the shadows. She realized then that her old life was gone, but her new one was even more beautiful. She wasn't just a girl who sold flowers anymore. She was the strength behind the man who ruled the city. As she smiled at a customer, Maya knew the truth. She was the Mafia's heartbeat, and the lion would never sleep again as long as she was by his side.